Welcome to this podcast of Super Special Kids and Cake. Yes, cake. I'm Granny Rhea.
And I'm Auntie Donia.
We're coming to you from the studios of Sacred Heart University in Fairfield, Connecticut. This podcast is brought to you by our book, Let's Talk, Navigating Communication Services and Supports for Your Young Child with Autism, published by Paul H. Brooks and available from Amazon.com.
As you know, every week we introduce a super special topic. These topics concern things that excite or aggravate us about trends in the field of special education. We may have some ideas that others don't always agree with, but we really do enjoy discussing them. Our super special topic for today is apraxia.
Apraxia? What the heck is that?
So, Granny Rhea, apraxia is a speech diagnosis where children have difficulty with the coordination to produce speech sounds. So it's more at the planning level, not that affects production, not at the speech production. But could you tell us a little bit more?
Sure. So apraxia was originally diagnosed in adults who have brain damage, usually as a result of a stroke. And when adults get this problem, they have trouble putting the sounds in a word together in the proper sequence. And so they end up saying things like biscotti, some of the kinds of things we hear little kids say when they're not fully developed. But it can be at a very profound level so that their speech is very, very hard to understand. Recently, I would say within the last 30 years or so, this diagnosis has begun to be applied to children. It has different names. It's sometimes called developmental apraxia of speech, or DAS. Sometimes it's called dyspraxia, meaning that it's a less severe form, but it still is a difficulty. And it is a kind of mysterious diagnosis because first of all, there's not a lot of research on what the origin of it is in children. We know it's not the same brain damage that adults have. Children do not have that kind of brain damage when they apparently have apraxia. The other thing about apraxia in children is that it doesn't just affect speech sounds. It also affects the prosody or the rhythm of speech or the melody of speech, so that it results in their sometimes putting the stress on the wrong syllables, so saying syllable instead of syllable. And it can also result in various kinds of disruptions in the flow of speech that don't sound like stuttering, but they still make the speech sound less smooth. So it has a lot of different components. But one thing that's very important to understand about apraxia of speech in children is that it has to be diagnosed in continuous speech. You can't diagnose apraxia in a child who's not talking at all or who's only saying one word at a time, because where apraxia happens is in the planning of multiple sounds in sequence. And if the child isn't saying a long string of sounds in sequence, then we can't identify the components that are necessary for the diagnosis of apraxia.
That's right, Granny Rhea. And I've also observed in the children that I've worked with who would have a diagnosis of childhood apraxia of speech that we sometimes see inconsistency in their production. So one day they may call the dog a dod, another time it could be a did, another time it could be a bod, a bok. So we see inconsistency in production. And the other observation I have seen, and I think this is also diagnostically a feature, is the groping that we can see. So we can see difficulty coordinating the articulators for speech. So that's the tongue, the lips, the jaw, and we sometimes see even difficulty in moving the jaw and what we call jaw gradation.
So you see the child's mouth struggling, in a sense, to produce the sound that he's trying to produce. Now, apraxia doesn't affect what children understand. They can understand speech and language at an age-appropriate level. Usually, if it's not associated with some other diagnosis, it doesn't affect their cognitive skills. And in children who are classically apraxic, it gets better, so that by the time they're teenagers, they can talk relatively fluently and normally. They might still have a few problems, but they generally have improved a great deal, at least, by the time they get to adolescence.
I think I always remind the people I work with more practice, you get more praxis. So that's where, just like you said, Granny Rhea, there's definitely the improvement. I think, though, for some therapists and for those of you parents listening, it can sometimes be confusing what the difference is between a speech sound disorder, where your child is having difficulty with the production of sounds, compared to what Granny Rhea was sharing with us, where it is a true childhood apraxia of speech. And childhood apraxia of speech may be present in children with autism, but if it is present, it's co-occurring. It is not a feature or a diagnostic feature of autism.
Right, and the other important thing to remember is we can't diagnose apraxia until the child is talking. So if your child is not talking at all, we can't make a diagnosis of apraxia because the diagnosis is based on the quality of their speech. If they have no speech at all, we can't say they have apraxia. Now, you might say, who cares? Do they have apraxia? Are they just not talking? What difference does it make? Well, it does make a difference in terms of the therapy that we would use. For a child with apraxia, the therapy approaches that have the most evidence base have to do with mass practice and repetition at the word level. So we don't generally work at the sound level for kids who have apraxia of speech. We don't teach them to say "buh," we teach them to say "ball." And we make them say "ball," or we encourage them to say "ball" over and over and over again, because what the therapy does is make those pathways from what the brain wants to say to what the mouth has to do to say it. It makes them stronger and eventually makes them automatic. We need to get to that level of automatic processing. For speech sound disorders, on the other hand, we take different approaches. We do work on one sound at a time, and we do work on building from sound to syllable to word. But with apraxia, the approach is different. So that's why it's important to not call every child who isn't talking apraxic.
And really to see a therapist who specialises in childhood apraxia of speech, who can actually support you with that diagnosis. And as Granny Rhea said, with the appropriate support and intervention, we do see that these children make wonderful progress.
Yes, they do, and it's gratifying to see.
Our super special question for today is, how do I know if my child needs speech intervention?
That's a great question, and I think it's one a lot of parents of very young children worry about. The truth of the matter is it takes kids a while to learn to talk. Talking is hard. We're the only animals that do it, and that's because it takes a lot of brain power as well as muscle power to do it. So for young children, we don't expect them to get all their sounds right until they're at best 4. And for many children, it's not until 6 or 7. We expect children between the ages of 4 and 7 to make some errors, usually on sounds that are kind of hard, like R and L and TH and F tend to be the sounds that persist in error for a longer period of time. But in spite of the fact that they're still making some errors in sound, they can still make themselves understood between these ages of 4 and 7. So although they might sound young or sound immature when they talk, people know what they're saying.
I think many of the errors that we hear in children who do have speech sound disorders are actually present in typical children, but they're just present at a much higher frequency. So your little 2-year-old is likely to call a Christmas tree a titmut tree, or variations of that, or a dog a dod. And so those processes you will hear within a typical child's speech, but because of the frequency of occurrence and because you're able to understand your child and other people as well, it's not problematic. I think it becomes a concern and problematic when you can't understand your child, and you can see that it's very frustrating and upsetting for your child that they're not understood, and that they're really trying to communicate something.
Yes, and there are some benchmarks for intelligibility, or how easy it is to understand a child, that can help us decide when a child is really significantly behind his peers in terms of making his speech intelligible. So for 2-year-olds, we expect about half of what they say to be understood by other people. By 3, we expect about 3/4 of what a child says to be intelligible. So a minority would be hard to understand, but most of what they say we can understand well. By 4, even though children may continue to make some mistakes, we expect their speech to be intelligible. So 4-year-olds should be able to communicate in such a way that people understand what they say almost all the time, even if they're still saying things like Tyrannosaurus Rex.
I think just as a consideration, if you have observed that your child is having speech sound difficulties, just to also make sure that you get a hearing check as well. Because although speech sound difficulties may not necessarily be linked to hearing difficulties, but we do also know that children who have recurrent upper respiratory tract infections, a fluid in the middle ear, or perhaps even a mild hearing loss, that would impact their speech sound development.
Yes, so you do want to get your child's hearing checked. Now, for those children that do show some delays in their speech sound development because of lots of ear infections or fluid in their middle ear, those problems do resolve rather quickly as soon as the child's hearing improves. But if the child does have a more chronic hearing loss, you certainly want to know that, even if it's mild, because the child may need some kind of auditory assistance, either a hearing aid or some other kind of assistive listening device, to make sure that they get everything that they need to get from the classroom.
And as Granny Rhea said, you'll see stages of development in terms of intelligibility, but you will also hear groups of sounds that develop as your child gets older. So the earlier sounds are those sounds that the child will see produce. So the p, the t, the p, the t, those sort of front sounds.
Yes, and the sounds that children tend to have more trouble with for longer are sounds that continue, like F's, S's, Z's, Z's, and also sounds that require a range of movements within the mouth, like R and W and L.
I think just one final little thought on that is that if your child is making speech, you hear those speech errors, to not be tempted to use them, and to actually make sure that you're always modeling the correct production.
Yeah, and you don't need to correct your child either. Just model what the correct pronunciation is. They'll get it. They'll pick it up. And most children do spontaneously outgrow speech delays by the time they get to school. The prevalence of speech delays in 6 and 7-year-olds once they're in school is about 6%. So there aren't a lot of them. And at that point, they would be eligible for services from a speech-language pathologist. And you can just make sure that that gets noticed if you're concerned about it once the child enters school.
Granny Rhea, what is the topic for this episode that makes us go,
aargh? Well, today's topic is a big pet peeve for a lot of us speech-language pathologists. Of course, kids make sounds with their mouths, and they use all the parts of their mouth to make the sounds exactly the way they need to sound. They use their tongue, they use their lips, they use their teeth, they use their jaw, and all of those articulators go together to make human sounds. So it would seem to make sense that if you have a speech problem, what you might need to do is something about those articulators. Right, Auntie Donia?
That's right. But I mean, as much as lollipops are fun and maybe enjoyable to eat, spending a lot of time licking lollies is not going to help your child produce the t or s sound. Blowing through a straw may help with your breath control, but that's certainly not going to help with directly support the production of sounds. And sometimes too much time, or just time, is spent with those activities. They could be activities that are fun, that are done for other reasons, but not to support speech sound development. And the research, Granny Rhea, is very clear about that too.
Yes, absolutely. There is research to show that working on oral motor strength or being able to move your tongue back and forth does not in and of itself improve speech. The moral that we have gathered from our review of the research on this kind of intervention is that if you want to help a child talk better, have him talk. Speech should always be part of speech therapy. And the reason for this is that even though the tongue and the lips and the jaw and all those parts of the mouth that we use for speech are also used for feeding and for breathing, in fact, the parts of the brain that control them differ depending on whether we're eating or breathing or speaking. In other words, there's a different part of the brain that sends messages to those muscles when the intention is to speak. And so training those muscles to do things that are related to breathing and eating won't help with speech because it's a completely different neural system that's controlling the production of speech.
That's such an important point, Granny Rhea. I love the science behind that. That's really wonderful.
A lot of the work showing these kinds of findings comes from a great mentor of mine, Ray Kent, from the University of Wisconsin. So what do you do? What should we do to improve kids' speech if they do have problems, Auntie Donia?
Well, I think one of the things is to support by modelling, making sure that you're repeating back the sort of correct model for the child, and then lots of different games that can be, there are sound lotto games, playing games like I Spy, where the child is sort of thinking of a sound, saying the word. Any of those games can be useful. Reading a book can be useful, and just making sure, even working on listening skills too, because a child has to be able to perceive a sound difference in order to produce a sound difference.
Yes, that's right. Perception has a lot to do with being able to program the production correctly. You have to know what the target is. What about if your child is in speech therapy and the speech therapist is doing a lot of these oral motor exercises, having the child chew on tubes, having him blow through straws, having him lick things? What do we do then, Auntie Donia?
I think as a parent, it can be sometimes difficult and intimidating to speak to a therapist and to say, actually, I've heard that this isn't necessarily helpful. But as a parent, the child is your child, and you can I know it may not be a comfortable conversation, but I think certainly addressing it with the therapist and saying to her, I would really prefer that you really focus on the speech sound development as opposed to some of these commercial tools that are out there. And we do have to be really careful that some of these tools will say they are quote unquote evidence-based, that there is research to support it, when that's not always the case.
Yes, not always. I mean, there may be reasons why it would be helpful to your child to use chewy tubes or to blow things through a straw. For instance, children with cleft palates can benefit from some of those kinds of exercises because they have differences in their anatomy that makes speech difficult. But if that's not the case for your child, it's not likely that those kinds of exercises will help. And of course, we do want to see children working on sounds. As we said earlier when we were talking about apraxia, if a child doesn't have apraxia but has just a developmental speech disorder, working on individual sounds, saying s, 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 what does a snake say, s, 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 is just fine. So it's not that they shouldn't work on isolated sounds. It's just that the goal should always be production of something that is incorporated into speech, whether it be a sound, syllable, or word.
And I think, Granny Rhea, to your point, if you are observing that your therapist is doing that, to ask the therapist, could you please explain to me why you're doing that? Because there could be something anatomical, and that's what they're doing. They're using that those tools or the materials to support that. And I think by better understanding the rationale, that would support you in knowing why they're doing that.
That's a great idea, Auntie Donia. I think we always have the right to ask, why are you doing that? It doesn't look to me like it's working on speech. Maybe you can explain it to me, is often a better approach than to say, well, I don't think you should be doing that.
Right.
So, we want to listen to what other people's rationales are, but in general, for the most part, if a child has a disorder that affects the production of individual sounds, not the ability to string those sounds together, and if the child is older than 4, then we really want to make sure that they're working on speech, the development of sounds, syllables, and words. Auntie Donia, what are we talking about for eating cake for breakfast today?
So today we are talking about water play.
Water play is so much fun. I love playing in water with kids.
I do too. And I love that it's something that's so accessible that you can do practically anywhere and any time of the year as well.
That's true. You don't have to have a pool. I have often used a tarp or an old shower curtain on the floor in the kitchen and put just a big tub of water, one of those big tubs where you might bathe an infant would be a great thing to use as a water bowl or a water table. Of course, lots of preschools have water tables, but you can make one at home by just covering your floor and putting some water in a big bowl.
And I've also done activities or encouraged families to just fill their sink with some water and have a little stool, and the children can wash their cups so they can see sort of what daddy or mummy are doing and copy them. But what I love about water play is the variety of materials that you can use with the water play. So you can use bottles that you fill and empty, you can have bubbles. I've sometimes added food colour to the water.
That's fun.
You can add sea creatures. I mean, you can really include all sorts of different play materials to encourage your children to both be, using language, communicating, but really the fun part is the most important thing here.
That's right. We do try to emphasize the fun part in this segment, but we can't help talking about how educational playing in water is. It trains fine motor skills for pouring. It trains observational skills for looking at different heights and quantities of water. You learn a lot about physics from playing with water, what sinks and what floats. All of those observations that a child makes, particularly if an adult is reinforcing them with language, they're all very educational, but we'll try not to talk too much about that in this segment.
Well, I think that to that point, though, Granny Rhea, it's that it becomes a natural way of teaching the child. So for children who have difficulty with concepts like wet and dry, it's far more meaningful when their hair's wet and then it's dry, or when they get wet and then they come out and they're wrapped in a fluffy towel to be dried.
Yes, so of course bath time is a great opportunity for water play, but it doesn't have to always be in a bathtub. It could be in a sink or in a bowl. Any of them are fine as long as you do make arrangements or make accommodations for the fact that the water is going to get out of it. You just have to be prepared for that. And once in a while, it's okay to take some old rags and just clean up the floor.
So I'd shared with Granny Rhea that a friend of mine, when he's doing bath time, will put his swimming trunks on before bath time because he knows that it's a time that, he's going to get wet because the children love to splash him. But to that point, he's always there. And we do just want to remind our listeners that it is really important to always keep an eye on your child when there is water around them.
Yes, as wonderful and fun as water is, even a small amount of it can be dangerous, particularly for super special kids. So we make it a rule when we play with kids with water, never to leave the room for any reason, for any length of time at all. If you need something, either take the child with you or get somebody else to get it for you. But we do need to be very vigilant when our kids are playing with water. But apart from that, water is a great deal of fun. What I do sometimes is I'll take one of those little wading pools, the plastic ones that you can get in the toy store for $5.99, and I'll put a smaller tub in that. And then the child and I get into the wading pool and we play with the water in the smaller tub. And then if it spills out into the bigger one, it's kind of easy to pick up.
And I love those paddling pools or wading pools because they're so light and they're easy to use, and you can use them in different environments. So if you're going to visit a family, it's something that you can take with you and use in the garden as well.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, they are a lot of fun in the garden when the weather is amenable. So we hope that you find lots of ways to use water safely and effectively to, yes, teach your kids something, but also just to have a great time for all super special kids, regardless of their age. You're never too old to play with water.
That's so true. Granny Rhea, I have my eye on today's cake.
Oh,
Tell us about today's cake.
Today's cake is a bread pudding cake. So it's bread pudding baked into a cake covered with powdered sugar. And it looks so beautiful. It looks like a mountain with snow sprinkled on it. It is so good. So we're going to have to taste it. I'm going to break off a little piece.
And actually, that looks like a snowflake just there.
It does.
It looks like they've
You're right.
It's really beautiful. Oh my goodness.
Crunchy.
Oh, that is so delicious.
This is a great choice. This cake comes from the Scratch Bakery in Milford, Connecticut, and we really enjoy their cakes a lot. We go there for lunch sometimes.
We
do.
They really. I just love that it tastes like it's home baked.
It does.
I love that.
Well, it is home baked in a sense.
Yeah.
They bake it right there in their own
That's
kitchen.
true.
So I guess
That's
that's home baked.
The Let's Talk About Super Special Kids and Cake podcast would like to thank our host, Sacred Heart University's School of Communication and Media Studies. We'd also like to thank our composer, Marty Eisenberg, our audio editor, Brent Morton, and our audio engineer and director of cake-based operations, Keith Stryovi.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed this podcast, please give us a review.